Sochaczewski. I'm one of the co-founders and senior researcher at GEPOM. GEPOM is an independent study and research group of Brazilians dealing with Middle East. It was established 2 years ago with the economist Najad Khouri, one that was born in Lebanon, one expert in the Gulf region, and an expert in oil and gas. It was co-founded by Omran here, with PhD in literature, one expert in the history of the diaspora from the Arab countries in Brazil, and by myself, Monique Sochaczewski Goldfeld. I'm a historian by training, and we do short courses, online courses about Middle East. I teach mainly about Ottoman history. I mean, have all the topics regarding Middle East. And we have lives, webinars about current issues on Middle East and about culture. So tonight is an honor to have here Najla Said. Najla is an artist, has books and plays and theaters in the United States, and she's a daughter of Edward Said. So Najla, ahlan wa sahlan, it's a big honor to have you here with us. Before we start our talk, I would like that Najad Khouri say some words as well. Please, Najad.
I'm so much excited, maybe more than Najla or more than Mariam, especially that today Najla said her mom wants to be in. I tried several times when I was in New York to make contact, but Mariam's always in the international jet set, going from Spain or Italy or Germany to New York. But in my last trip, through other cousin, Layla May, which I always meet anytime I go to New York, I told her, like, I would love to see Najla, and she said, and she made an appointment. So we had a dinner, very nice dinner with all the family, and I told her about the idea to talk with us at Japan, and she welcomed. And so here we are, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
So Najla, welcome, ahlan wa sahlan. It's an honor to have you here. So I would like to start our talk asking you to talk a little bit about what do you think it's important to highlight from your father's biography, Edward Said, and especially the culture. He loved music, and you are an artist. So what do you think it's important to highlight about his life, especially in the culture side for the Brazilian public?
Well, I think that my father really he was a pianist as well as all of the other things that he did. And I think in terms of art, it was always a huge part of his life. And I think for his father, my grandfather, in his eyes, my father becoming a professor was enough of a scandal, as opposed to being a businessman. So my father never had the opportunity to pursue art. He was very much enamored of the piano and was really, really talented as a musician. I think my dad was certainly satisfied with what he chose to do and his accomplishments. But I think so for me, I think there was a part of him that allowed me to pursue theater, even though it was probably not the smartest idea, because he had not had that opportunity. And so I feel like in some ways I represent the evolution of another side of him that didn't get to be fully expressed. And I try in my work to talk about his ideas in my own words, in my own way, because I think a lot of people have trouble sometimes with the really intellectual texts and academic texts that he wrote. But I think there's a few important ideas that I think should always be connected to him and his work. And the first one is obviously Orientalism. And I would say that the main thing that I and most people have taken from that is, first of all, this thing in America now that we call microaggressions, which is sort of a racism that isn't overt, but people making fun of cultural stereotypes and things. And he really opened that whole world up in a lot of ways, and we don't realize it now because it's become part of our just the way that we see the world, all of us, especially in America. It's gotten a little out of hand, but in terms of looking for things that might be offensive or might be Western or white person's view of a culture. And so in Orientalism, he really encouraged or brought the idea out of we should tell others who we are and not be defined. We had up until that point in history, everyone from the East was sort of lumped together and exoticized, and it was all in the view of the West from their fantasies. And so I think in my work particularly, but in his work as well, there was a lot of focus on how can we properly tell people that we have an incredible language and culture and history of art of our own, poetry, music. And just because it doesn't sort of fall in line with what Western ideals of art are, doesn't mean that it's not equally important or, interesting. And I think also that essentially the idea that we should define ourselves and not let others define us. I think that's one. And then there's the second idea that he was most sort of taken with was this idea of contrapuntalism, which he took from music. It's, I think, the idea that you can have two separate melodies that don't necessarily go together, but they still create, harmony. And he took this idea to another level when he formed this orchestra with Daniel Barenboim, who maybe you guys know because he's originally from Argentina, which is, I think, close to Brazil. I'm just kidding. So, and he's Israeli. So they formed this orchestra, this project with Arab and Israeli musicians. And it was based on that sort of contrapuntal idea of these two narratives, the history of the Jewish people and the history of Palestine and the Nakba are equally valid narratives, but they're never gonna meet. So is there a way we can find to coexist and create some sort of harmony without trying to necessarily deny the other's story? So I think that and I've said this before, I think he even used that when my brother and I used to fight. He would say, Najla, you tell me what happened. And then I would have to stand there and he would say to my brother, now you tell me what happened. And then we had to sort of agree that we had a different perspective and that, we could make I think he always sided with my brother though, but it doesn't matter. Just kidding. But so there was that one. And I think that the last and probably most important would be the idea of humanism, which he kind of went back to at the end. And the last book he wrote was Humanism and Democratic Criticism. And I think that those kind of, not to leave out everything he gave to literature and the scholarship of literature, which was really, really what his profession was. But I think he was able to take these ideas and apply them to literature and then apply them to larger constructs, which was probably what was so brilliant.
So beautiful. You already brought a lot of issues that I wanted to talk with you. And the idea is after our talk, we'll have questions, Q&A from the audience as well, okay? You talked a little bit about Orientalism. And Najla Said is very, very famous. This is my copy, and a lot of everyone in Brazil has one copy. It's very popular in the universities. And he wrote this book when you were a child. So what can you tell us specific about Orientalism, about how he dealt with the popularity of this book? And you already brought some issues, but how you can tell to the Brazilian audience about his relation with this book? Please.
Well, I think what was most interesting, he wrote it, I was 4 when it came out. So he was writing it when I was 2 and 3. So I had no idea what was going on. I just knew we were living in California for a year and a half. And it's interesting, when I went to college, I majored in comparative literature and I had to read it for a history class called The World in the West. And just the introduction, because they only usually assign the introduction for some classes. And the first thing I realized in college was that not only was it was read in Buddhism class, it was read in art history, it was read in, so that was the first time I was like, what did he do? I mean, I always knew about the book, but I didn't. But when I asked him what I should say in class, he said, tell them that Orientalism was written by a young man who, had he written it 10 years later, it would have been different. And I thought, okay, what the hell does that mean? But at that time, it was 1992 or 93 when I was a freshman in college. He was about to release Culture and Imperialism, which was sort of the sequel. And I feel like he may have thought that was an improvement upon Orientalism. Yeah. So what's interesting is that idea that he actually realized that, you know, as scholarship goes on and then people start to criticize the argument from a book from 1978. And I think what he realized was that it was good and it was groundbreaking and all these things, but there was always more. There was always work to be done and refined and clarified and things like that. I mean, I think right now, particularly in America, we have this sort of idea of cancel culture and political correctness. And I think he would lament the fact that there's very little nuance left in discussing these things. You don't just cancel people. We learn from reading because their way of existing in the world or telling stories or making art is a result of the culture and the world in which they came from and live. And so the idea of just canceling white writers, it never really appealed to him because there was also inherent virtue in the art itself. So I always wonder right now how he would react, because he even told me, because I was young during the period when in America people started calling themselves African American or Latin American, or so he would say, you know, you have to be careful with that because the more you separate, the more you're not integrating. And I was confused by that. But I think, you know, if you look at like Lebanon or Iraq or any of these countries where they went out of their way to separate us into groups, it only creates conflict. So I think it was a bit more complicated and nuanced, this idea of, you know, saying I'm Palestinian American or saying, because to him, identity was not one thing. It was many different things. So that was a long answer to what was not really your question. But
no, it's amazing. And we have these discussions inside Japan, me and Muna, especially because I always say that everyone loves Orientalism in Brazil. I love this book. But I always say that culture and imperialism is a kind of improvement. And you are saying exactly that he had this feeling. Yeah. So Muna.
I mean, it was like 15 years later. So it's very much like, you know, I'm almost 48. And so he was what, 30 something when he wrote, he was not 40. He was barely 40 when he wrote Orientalism. So, you know, I wrote a play 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And when I look at it now, I think there's more that I can do or stuff that I could have done better. So I think that's just a natural, but the culture of imperialism is of course meant to be an extension or a continuation of that argument.
So yes, that's a kind of a dual, and it's very good. I have 8 books of your father, and I prefer Culture Imperialism and Out of Place.
Yeah,
his memoir. But I would like to know what do you prefer? What do you think he preferred as all his books? And what book you think that people has to learn more beyond Orientalism?
I think it depends. It's interesting. It sort of depends what your interests are. For me, as someone who is always interested in art and literature, my favorite is Representations of the Intellectual. It's also short. So for me, I find that, and that's, you know, it's actually great for, as people, you know, in America, someone like James Baldwin his work and his stuff was suppressed for a long time. And now everyone's sort of discovering his work. So my father talks about him and the role of intellectuals and public intellectuals. And I think that that's important for the period we're in. I also think the question of Palestine is incredibly important for learning about Palestine. I mean, I think it was written a long time ago, but it still, I think, tells everything you would need to know to be able to have an intelligent argument about that subject. And then I think also After the Last Sky, which has pictures in it. I'm like, it has pictures, it's short, like I'm horrible. No, but After the Last Sky is also a beautiful book, but they all sort of stand on their own. And I think the last two books, just because it was the end of his life, and so you can see how and where his ideas came together or didn't. The last two books, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, and then On Late Style, which was written after we published it posthumously, so he didn't actually finish it. We had a few people work on it to make it into a full book. So that's a good way to sort of see where he was at the end of his life, which I think is a point, particularly Late Style. Yeah, so that's what I would say. I mean, there's so many. And then of course, honestly, Out of Place is one of the best ways to get into who he is and who he was, because unlike me, who when I write, you can see my entire personality in the work because I write in a very casual, personal style. His work is very intellectual. So if you want to hear him as a human, I think Out of Place is sort of the perfect one for that.
And Najla, he says in Out of Place that he started to write this book in 1994, 2 years after you all as a family, you had a trip to Palestine.
Yes.
And you yourself, this travel, it was important in your biography as well.
Yes.
Afterwards, you wrote one play and then one book about how being confused.
Yes.
About identities. Can you share with the Brazilian, with the public here about these personal writings and even
Sure.
the connections with his work?
Well, when I was growing up, I grew up in New York City and I went to school with a bunch of rich white people. I mean, that's really all I can say. I went to a very elite school. Jackie Onassis went to the school, like Queen Noor went to the school. It was very blue-blooded American rich people, and I didn't fit in at all. I lived on the west side and the school was on the east side, and all my friends were quite wealthy and all of sort of came over on the Mayflower, and I never fit in. But because of the way I looked, I was always trying to be white. And it was the 80s and 70s where people didn't really talk about their ethnicity. So one of my friends mothers asked me what kind of name was my name, and I said, I don't know. Because I was so scared of being different. And I just didn't understand where we were from, because ironically, I would watch TV and, when I was 5, there was the hostage crisis in Iran. So I would see Muslims and like Ayatollah, all these images, and I didn't connect to me with anything that I'd ever seen in Lebanon. So, and we're not Muslim. We are Christian, and my dad was Anglican, which made it, I was just so confused. So by the time I was about 12, the first Intifada started and I started paying attention. And I was of the age where I started caring about things like South Africa and all these other things that were going on in the world. And then my father was diagnosed with leukemia when I was 17. And then when I was 18, we went to Palestine. And for me, it was a very difficult trip because I'd gone to Lebanon most of my life, and I felt like I was from there, even though I was half Palestinian and American. But in Palestine, everyone thought we were Jewish visiting, and we were only in Palestine. We didn't really go to Israel at all, except the airport. And I'm a very sensitive person. I'm sort of overly empathic sometimes. And I think I was overwhelmed with the guilt of being able to have grown up in America and have, my grandfather had gotten American citizenship and then gone back to Palestine. So my dad and all his siblings were born with US citizenship. So I had not been really a refugee. My father wasn't really a refugee. And yet this country was my country, and these people were literally, I was just horrified, and I felt terribly guilty. And I had already had anorexia, and it became worse on the trip because I felt, that survivor guilt. why am I so lucky? And it was another interesting angle of the book was my eating disorder, because it was also, I think, a way of my rejecting my own culture, because, in the Middle East, if you don't eat food, you're rude. So, but it actually helped me get better in a way. So there was a lot going on that trip, but I think for me, the hardest part of the trip was, besides Gaza, which was overwhelmingly sad, was going to my dad's house in West Jerusalem. And he grew up in, a neighborhood that was quite upper class, and it still is, except now it's only Israelis, rich Israelis. And he wouldn't go inside the house. And he looked like a little boy who got lost, and he looked like he was going to cry, but wouldn't cry. And I'd never seen my father like that. And we were like, don't you want to go inside? And he was like, no. And he was pointing to where he was born. There was this room, I was born there, but he wouldn't enter. And of course, the irony on top of irony was that no one lived in the house. It had become something called the International Christian Embassy, which was a Zionist Christian organization, South African. And so, the irony was awful. Like, my brother and I thought when we went to our house, we would see a Jewish name that we knew because one of our friends in New York had the same name. And yet it wasn't Jewish people in our house. It was Christian Zionists, which added another level of confusion and sort of irony and sadness. And I think for me, that was the hardest day of the trip, besides Gaza.
Najla, I am Jewish and I'm half Israeli, and probably when you were there, I was living there. Maybe we can even meet without knowing each other. And I think it's very important, if you can tell to Brazilian audience especially, because the Palestinian issue is very, very important. But Edward Said had Jewish friends in Cairo. He writes about them in Princeton. He wrote about the anti-Semitism that he witnessed during his days as students in Princeton. And you live in New York, so he was in Columbia, but New York's a city. You talked in other occasions about that. You had a lot of Jewish.
Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot to say that. I switched schools and my friends were all Jewish and I fit in better.
Yeah, so I would like to ask you about he had Jewish friends, how he dealt with the Jews in the academic world, and even in the idea of a binational one state solution to Israel and Palestine. So,
well, one of the things I think, first of all, I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which not everyone knows. It's a traditionally Jewish neighborhood, but old, like, socialist Jews, not what you think now. And something happened in New York where there's sort of different, now there were richer Jews who made a lot of money, who moved to the Upper East Side and were pretending to be not Jewish. That was happening. But the people I grew up with were mostly intellectuals with socialist views. It's a kind of Jewish culture that doesn't really exist here anymore. Because essentially Jewish people in America have become white people in the sense that they are not really discriminated against. They are secretly, of course, but they've made it and they're considered white in a lot of circumstances. So I think, so the Jewish people I grew up with were not, that my family was close to, were already quite progressive and lovely and smart. But some of the people I went to school with were more just the typical American Jew who supports Israel no matter what and never questions anything. So a lot of my friends would say, I saw your father on TV and he was really cool and really smart, but I disagree with him. And one thing that often happened was, because he was so elegant and well-dressed, and because his English was probably better than most Americans or Brits, people respected him. And so they loved to have him on the news. So everyone thought my father was this incredibly good-looking, suave, debonair person who was brilliant, but I disagree with him, which was kind of interesting because there were people like who thought he was a terrorist, but a lot of people respected him, but didn't. I mean, a lot of the Jewish people I grew up with respected him, but disagreed with him completely. But how he dealt with that was something I learned early on, which is he never denied the Holocaust, or he never, he actually spoke about it, is what I'm saying. He literally would write about, I think he wrote an essay once about, that through the eyes of a Canaanite or something, like through our eyes. He always, and when he started the project of the orchestra with the students who were Palestinian or Arab and Israeli, he brought them all to Buchenwald. And he said it was always very important for us to understand the Jewish history. And just as important for Jews to understand our history and the Nakba and what happened to us, but that we need to know that this was something that happened that was not okay. And it's not something to minimize, but it in no way does it justify the treatment of Palestinians now, and that they're two different things. And I think before people talked about the difference between Zionism and Judaism, he was very clear that he was anti-Zionist. And I learned that from him. And it was very hard for me to say that because in New York, a lot of people don't see that there's a difference between Judaism and Zionism. That's usually because they don't have enough knowledge of the subject and they're Jewish and they're very protective. But the thing is, Zionism is an exclusionary political policy, and Judaism is a religion. So the two really are not the same thing. Also, as you mentioned, my mom grew up in Lebanon, and when she grew up, first of all, her mother as a little girl put money in a blue box on her. She had a German Jewish friend in Beirut, and she put money in the blue box because she was like, the Jews should have a home. She didn't know it was Palestine. And my mom grew up with Jewish kids. The Jewish neighborhood of Beirut was where my mom's school was, and my grandmother ran the school. And then she would always say you didn't really know if someone was Muslim, or maybe they were fasting on Ramadan, so you'd be like, oh, she must be Muslim, but it wasn't this world where people were divided like that. And my father was brought into the world by a German Jewish midwife who prayed over him in Hebrew and Arabic. It was a different world. And I think what he always made clear to me was that Europe was the home of anti-Semitism. And Europe was where the problem came from. And that we were kind of all, we were being scapegoated as these sort of anti-Semites, when in reality it had nothing to do with us. And it was the guilt of the rest of the Western world for the Holocaust and all the other horrible things that they had done to Jews over the centuries, that Palestine became Israel and all of that. It really didn't, we had never had a history of being anti-Semitic in the way that they have had in Europe. And so he made that really clear to me. And I think that also he was a humanist. He judged people on their humanity. And so I think we didn't live in a home where we talked badly about Jewish people. If someone was Jewish, they were Jewish. It wasn't like what people probably think, which is upsetting because I think people think we're all sort of racist. But, unlike, contrary to what someone like Golda Meir would say, Palestinians' existence is not, Palestinians are not, to be told, especially in America, you're kind of told that a Palestinian is someone who hates Jews. And that's not what we are. We are people of our own who were unfortunately kicked out of our homes because Jewish people decided, Europeans decided that they should kill all Jews. It's also, so he was very clear about that distinction.
Thank you for that, Najla. It's very important to clarify many things. And you talked about Lebanon. And it seems that he asked to be buried in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. So what can you tell why he decided that? And what is his connections with Lebanon and your connections as well?
So it's interesting. My father's mother, so my paternal grandmother, she was half Lebanese. So he had family in Lebanon, and his mother and father moved there. They lived in Egypt, and then when they had to leave Egypt, they went to Beirut. His father's buried in Lebanon because they didn't want to bury him in Jerusalem because, I don't know, the grave might be disturbed. You don't know what's going on there. So I always thought my father wanted to be cremated and have his ashes scattered over the Mediterranean, because that's what he always said. But before he died, he was in Lebanon, and my mom comes from a very small Quaker. There are 3 Quaker families in Lebanon, and my mom's is one. And you know, the Quakers are very peaceful and simple and human. You know, the idea of secular humanism, I think, became more real to him when he married my mom, and he sort of became part of her family, where that was how they thought and behaved. So before he died, we were in Lebanon, and he told my mom he wanted to be buried in this Quaker family cemetery in the mountains. So it's my mom's family. It's my maternal grandparents, great grandparents, aunts, uncles, and my mom presumably will be buried there. And we've got a very old olive tree, and we put it over the grave facing toward Jerusalem. I think not being in Palestine was partly because it's complicated. And I mean, even just burying him in Lebanon was complicated because we had to cremate him first and then just bury the ashes. But I think he wanted to be in a peaceful place. And, you know, Lebanon was a place for him, like it became for me. My mom is so rooted there. And also my dad's family is there, where he felt like it was a home. I mean, I think it's our home in the Middle East. And he does have, his mother, as I said, was half Lebanese, and her family is from a village right near where he's buried. So it's also that. And he spent the summers there when he was a kid. I mean, he hated it, but so I think it was the closest place to being home without really being, you know, in Jerusalem. And honestly, he left Jerusalem when he was so young. I don't know if he really felt connected to it in that like way of the actual land, which is interesting because most Palestinians are so attached to the land, and to him, Palestine was more of an idea and a human rights story. Yeah.
Part of your family has a surname Makdisi, and I believe it's connected to Al-Quds, to Jerusalem.
Yes.
Usama Makdisi.
It's complicated. I'm going to confuse you now. My mother's mother, her maiden name is Makdisi. So the side of my family that Najad is from is Makdisi. But then my dad's sister married one of my mom's cousins, who's a Makdisi. So Usama Makdisi, Karim Makdisi, and Sari Makdisi, who are all scholars who write a lot. They're my first cousins and my second cousins. So they're my first cousins on my dad's side, and there's my second. But Makdisi, the name, it's like the person went on a pilgrimage to Al-Quds. And so I think it's also, Najad would know, it's Khouri Makdisi because someone was a priest in Khouri.
Yeah. So I would like to ask you my last question before we go to the Japon friends and to the public. It's Brazil. What do you think should be interesting? What do you know about Brazil? You have relatives in Brazil.
Yeah, so the first
thing
thing
interesting to learn about Brazil, and please come to visit us in Brazil.
I would love to. Well, when I went to acting school, I had a very good friend who was Brazilian who was an actress who had come to study in New York, and she didn't know any English, but she knew my name, and she was the only one who pronounced it correctly. She said, I know so many Najlas, I know so many Saids. And I was like, why? She's like, because I live in Sao Paulo. And I was like, what is going on in Brazil? So that was the first thing I learned, that there were lots of Arabs in Brazil. My dad had an uncle. So his father had 2 brothers. My grandfather and one of his brothers came to America, And my grandfather went back to Palestine, but one brother stayed in America. And then the third brother, David, went to Brazil. And as far as we know, he didn't have a family, but I feel like he might have. So there's that. And then we were once in the south of France visiting some friends, and they had invited some Brazilians over, Lebanese friends. And my mom said, I think they're my cousins. And I was very confused, but they turned out to be our cousins. So we have family there that I don't really, I mean, besides Najad, but like we have cousins. I have lots of cousins, it seems, in Brazil. And then the other thing, I mean, besides like thong bikinis and butts and all the other things that people think of Brazil, I also am sort of fascinated. I did a play where I played this like Brazilian girl who was in the Brazilian Revolution, some revolution, I don't know, it was so long ago, but I learned a lot about the politics. But I also find Brazil fascinating because I feel like it's probably the only country that's similar to America in its
melting pot.
Yeah, it's multiracial, but I feel like you handle it better. Race. I don't know because I'm not there, but I feel like, I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of, I've heard certain things, but you know, it's the only country that sort of looks like America. There's black and white and everyone's from somewhere else. And so I sort of find that fascinating because I feel like maybe not being the United States of America makes it a little more of an interesting cultural mix, but I could be totally wrong. I could be Orientalizing Brazil. I don't know.
You must come and visit your relatives and us in Japan, in Brazil, for sure.
I would love to.
Najla, thank you for these talks. So we have almost the same age, and we're sure we can become friends after this.
Of course.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask if my friends of Japan, if they have questions to Najla, or we can open up for the public. Muna. Najad?
I'd like to thank Najla and her mother, Miss Mariam Said. She's also here with us.
Yeah, you can ask her questions.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank you a lot for being here with us and talking. But I'd like to know, you have a book called Growing Up in an Arab Family, an Arabic American Family.
Yeah, it's called Looking for Palestine.
Yeah. In which we discuss the challenge of negotiating your Arab identity and the second generation, and how to be a second generation immigrant in America. Can you tell us about this? How to be, how you're feeling in this moment, especially?
What's interesting for me was that, as I said, when I was growing up, everyone in America who was different would try to be white. And, you know, as a child, my brother has very, very dark skin, and he was much more discriminated against, like, to his face. And I was not. And I was with little girls. I was at a girls' school anyway. And so I just tried to blend in as much as possible. And I would focus on being Episcopalian and Christian. And my dad went to Harvard and Princeton. Like, I'm American. And then as I got older, and then of course, when I started acting, I was just a white person. And then 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden in America, you're Arab American. So I had to sort of take on this identity that I didn't understand, because I don't necessarily feel Arab or American, and I'm not sure what if I feel like a combination. I feel like I'm both. So I had a lot of difficulty with that identity. And I think, as I said earlier, I kind of keep going back to my dad. Your identity is made up of many, many things. There's plenty of TV shows and movies about Arabs, and I don't relate to them because, let's say, they're Muslim and they're from Egypt. So their story in America is not similar to mine. Also, I try to make clear that class is a huge part of it, that people don't talk about. And also there were different waves of immigration of Arabs. The ones that came here a long time ago were Lebanese and Syrian and mostly Christian. And the newer immigrants are mostly Muslim from Iraq or wherever, Yemen, etc. So all it did was make me realize that even calling yourself Arab American doesn't really explain anything. So to me, it's a facet of my identity and not my identity. And one thing that I thought was interesting was I called the play, which became a book, I just called it Palestine. And I got an award from a feminist organization for writing a feminist play. So I thought, well, what if I wrote a play called Woman? Would I have gotten an award for being Palestinian? You know what I'm saying? It's like whatever anyone sees of your identity is what they will define you as. But in reality, your identity is fluid and complicated. And I think the more I try to focus or say I'm Arab American, the more I feel trapped. However, I don't deny being Arab, which is another. So on the one hand, you have to defend and not be ashamed, but you also can't make that all of who you are, because that's reductive anyway.
I am the first generation of Lebanese family here in Brazil. My father is from Syria and my mother is from Lebanon, from the same place as your mother from Tripoli, Trablus.
Yes.
Yes. And I felt myself sometimes not Brazilian and not Lebanese, in between.
Yeah.
Yeah, in between. I don't feel, at the same time, I feel very passionate to Lebanon, also to Brazil. And I think that the worst place, sometimes I felt in between, and sometimes I felt myself out of place as your father. That's
years ago. Yeah, we went to Lebanon to do this performance and of my grandmother's book, and the young people were trying to. They were probably born in the 1990s, and they were like, "You don't understand Lebanon. This is that," and I almost started crying because I was like, "I lived through the civil war here. You weren't even born. You don't even know Lebanon. Like, do you know?" So these generations also, your experience is completely different, because I think a lot of the people who lived through the civil war in Lebanon don't talk about it to their kids. So their kids, and that was my entire childhood, was being Lebanese. And Lebanese when I was a kid was not, ooh, it's like the Riviera. It was horrible. You did not want to be from Beirut. And then at some point it switched, and I was supposed to be embarrassed about being Palestinian, but it was okay to be Lebanese. So there's no way that you can even define, what does it mean to be even Lebanese?
Yes, you are right. Thank you a lot for your answer. And I'd like to ask a question to your mother, Najla Said. She's also here. If you allow me to ask her.
Yes, go ahead, mommy. Come on.
Yeah, I'd like to just to know about the project of, because we have the Said Foundation, Berebuan and Said Foundation, and you have some new project. What are the projects of this foundation?
You know, Najla mentioned briefly that Edward and Daniel Barenboim, the conductor, were friends, and they started a project as an experiment of bringing Arab and Israeli musicians for a workshop in Germany, in Europe, in 1999. The idea was very successful. At the end of the workshop, Daniel made an orchestra out of them. And this orchestra is called the West Eastern Divan. And it used to be a youth orchestra, but now the whole project mushroomed with time. And unfortunately, Edward did not see it when it really flourished. So there is the orchestra, which is made of Arabs and Palestinians, and now it is an adult orchestra. It has some young people in it. We also have the Barenboim Said Academy in Berlin, which is a music conservatory of higher education. You get a university degree. And we have a small conservatory on the West Bank in Ramallah, because the Palestinians did not have music schools of very high standard. And we have this as our nucleus there, where we train, you know, the musicians on a very high level. The idea of this project is based on Edward and Daniel's friendships, and on their conversations about music and society. And they have a book called Parallels and Paradoxes, which talks about that. So this is the project I'm involved in.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for sharing it, and good luck. And we are happy to have you here.
The book was translated into Portuguese, this talk
Yes.
between Danielle and Edward. Thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here, Najla Said.
Thank you.
I believe that Najad wants to talk, and Nancy has a question as well, but Najad, please.
Yes, for sure. I'm so excited to meet Mariam through this web because she's the missing ally between me, and I met Wadad when I was young, and I had good contact with Salma, who was
That's my grandmother and my
yeah, and everybody loves Salma because I had a girlfriend at Ahli school, and Salma would allow me to sneak in and talk to my girlfriend, which was not so common, So Mariam probably knows very well my father because they are the same generation, they are direct cousins, and of course, maybe someone don't know, but Mariam's grandfather, Georgios, was an intellectual, and he has also books, and they are in the Congress Library. And when I was young, we had the collection of, I think, Mawrid al-Safi, which is a very rare collection of magazine. It was published in the 30s. And when I was in Tripoli, we had this collection, and unfortunately, because of the war, and we left the home, and we lost this collection. And I'm trying to go back when I go to Lebanon to see if it's in the old house, which was bought by some other people, and I don't know if they kept it. And when I was in the Library of Congress, they asked me about this collection. And I don't think anybody in the family has this, Mawrid al-Safi. And it's a very nice, let's say, it's very beautiful collection of writings in the 1930s, 1940s, or something like that. So it's very nice to see Mariam here. I hope to see you in New York, or maybe you come.
Inshallah, definitely.
Inshallah, come to Brazil, have some time,
Yeah,
open home, and you'll enjoy to be here. Okay.
You have a tour guide here as well. I have a license. We have a question from Nancy. Nancy, please, you can open it.
I have a very short question for Miriam and a very short question for Najla. Miriam, I remember the first time I read in the New York Times about the East-West Van Orchestra, I was just sobbing at the end because it had just come to us in America at the time through the New York Times. And I just thought to myself, oh my God, if my parents weren't ill, how could I go there and be a volunteer? And now you tell me how much it's grown, and basically the large part seems to be in Berlin, right, the headquarters. And I was just wondering if there is ever, like, during a certain season, a need for volunteers or anything, any way you can get involved with the East. Well, I don't know what it's called now because it's now.
Actually, it has become so big that it is very well staffed. But actually, they
live in New
York.
Do you live in New York?
In New York and here in Rio.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
So in New York, we're having in 2023 an ensemble that is coming, and they will be playing in several cities. Wonderful. But we played in Brazil in 2005.
Only once? I thought you were always down there.
We're only in Argentina.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. I'll have to find some way to see the orchestra, and congratulations on it.
Yeah, but if you are in Berlin, you are very welcome to go and visit the academy, and there you can meet the students and perhaps attend a concert.
Thank you very much. Okay, my second question is the following, and it's to your daughter. Tell me what you think about this. I am born in California, raised in the United States. My grandparents were Hungarian and the others were Polish and Russian, the grandparents. And so I also felt out of place for many of the reasons he stated. I'm second generation. So I find it very innovating especially after, I was grateful to read your father's book, Out of Place, and also Amin Malouf's book, In the Name of Identity, helped a great deal too with my life. So with everybody's life. So don't you think that one of the main problems on earth is that people in political power number one, they don't understand the difference between ethnicity and nationality. And number two, when they do understand it, it's used to project the divisions that they want to project. You mentioned that. And number three, they just do not want to acknowledge that there is only one race on this little planet. So, which also, what do you feel about that?
Well, it's interesting because I think that, in America, especially
excuse me. And also my other big question is, what is nationality today? It's sort of passé.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I'm Palestinian and Lebanese, but I can't be a citizen of Lebanon because it's a patriarchy and I am Lebanese through my mom. And there is no Palestine to speak of that I can be in. So I'm stuck being American. So literally I'm American, that's it. And I don't know what that means either, because if someone said American, they certainly wouldn't imagine me, right? They would think a white person, maybe a fat person. I don't know what the rest of the world thinks of Americans, a warmonger, an idiot, whatever people think of us, but that doesn't describe me at all. So it's, I'm actually a third generation American because my grandfather, but I've never been able to pursue that thought because people identify my dad as foreign all the time. And it's funny because he may have been born in another country, but he was born with an American passport. So he was always American. And I find that frustrating too, because he's never celebrated as an American. And that's what he should be celebrated as. Of course, it's wonderful that he's celebrated as a Palestinian. That's very important, but he was an American his entire life. And he doesn't seem to be allowed to claim that according to whatever the powers that be in this country. He was always othered and foreign because he was proud of his heritage. But the other thing I was thinking of when you said that is sort of, and I don't know what the news coverage is like in Rio, but I can only speak for this country. The news here was entirely about COVID, and then it switched. And now it's entirely about Ukraine. And I've had more difficulty with this than anything because, of course, I completely empathize. I was in Lebanon twice and had to evacuate, once as a little girl and once on my own as a grown-up. So, of course, I empathize and understand, and I'm actually deeply troubled and sort of have PTSD from watching the footage. But I'm sure you guys heard the coverage here is unbelievable. Like, nobody can seem to understand that blonde people can, this whole idea that they look like us, they're white. But also, and then reductiveness of like not buying Russian vodka or not going to, and it's exactly what you said, Russians and Ukrainians are like this. Russians spend summers in Ukraine, half the families are here. It's not this thing that, and Americans don't know anything. Half these people think that a lot of people I've spoken to up until like a month ago thought Ukraine was just a part of Russia, right? Because everyone here my age was raised during the Cold War, so they didn't bother to check the map after 1990. I don't know. But it seems like, or does anyone, nobody knows that Ukraine is surrounded by like 8 countries, nobody knows yet. So I think that speaks very much to what you're saying. And I wasn't, you kind of cleared it up for me, because I feel like the powers that be, or the news media, or whomever it is, or Joe Biden decides that this is how we're viewing the world, and these people are good and these people are bad. And I'm utterly confused, because Zelensky is like become the new hero, which is great. He's doing great stuff for Ukraine, but he also said in May that Israel was the victim and they were being attacked by Palestine because he's Jewish and he's a Zionist. So all of these things are more complicated than these simple classifications. And in terms of, like you said, I had a boyfriend once, and his family came here a long time ago, and I said, where were they from? And he said, Austro-Hungary. And I laughed, and I was like, that's not a place. He goes, we don't actually know exactly, but they came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it's exactly what you're saying. I don't know what these sort of nationality, think nationalism is healthy anyway, but I don't know what these things are, especially in a globalized world. And the more children, you know, my niece and nephew, they're half Irish, half Palestinian. The levels of, you know, actually they're 3/4 Palestinian, 1/4 Irish, I shouldn't, but you know, I'm just saying there's so many levels of identity, and their mom, who's half Irish, half Palestinian, identifies as Palestinian because she feels like the Irish are okay. No one's attacking them right now. So she's going to be outspokenly tell people she's Palestinian, which I find adorable because I would be like, I'm half Irish, you know, but none of this really means anything in the end. So I sort of agree with you. I don't know if that answered it, but I'm on your team.
Najla, we have a lot of cute comments. Congratulations from the audience. And we have 2 questions. Leonardo raised hand. Leonardo Landucci, please, our student.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. Monique, are you listening to me well?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. First, I would like to thank Najla for your time. It's amazing to hear about your father. He's been a great inspiration for me. I'm today conducting a research in London, and it's basically based on his work. So it's amazing to talk to you and to get to know him through a source like this. And I wanted to know, to ask you, how is for you to see your father's work being influential and in being part of the discussion even nowadays, even after all this time? How do you feel about it? How do you see it?
It's overwhelming, I think, because it's funny because people always people who are older than I am will talk about how Orientalism changed the world and changed scholarship, but I was born before it, but I was 2. So there are moments where I realize, you know, everyone's like, we have to change the narrative and all these things that people say all the time, and they don't know where they come from. And I mean, I don't think my father invented that phrase, but that was how he talked, like giving us permission to narrate or tell our story, or the true, like the narrative of the true, the other side, the other, or using the word other, the other. Again, not necessarily things he invented, but things he definitely, so people will always tell me that until, you know, people who are art scholars of art and art history, as I said, Buddhism and Eastern religion, and how it shaped their ideas. And I get overwhelmed, but it wasn't really until social media that, I mean, he died in 2003, and I was aware that he was well known, but I thought it was simply like academics and Arabs who knew who he was. And then he died, and I was just overwhelmed. To see memes of your dad is also, you know, bizarre. And I get frustrated because he's not credited enough. But, you know, a lot of, like, for example, Cornel West has become very popular in mainstream media, and they were friends, and all Cornel West is doing is basically saying what my dad would have said, but my dad never had that sort of platform. So in that regard, people are Cornel is wonderful. He always mentions my dad. So during the Black Lives Matter protests, after George Floyd was killed, he was on CNN, and he said, you know, and they're all there standing on the shoulders of Edward Said and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, on CNN. And everyone called me because it was about Black Lives Matter. And I thought, wow, you know, I always think these things should be his like stuff. But then I'm like, well, maybe I'm just being arrogant. But then when the rest of the world sees it, there was another writer who I admire very much who tweeted something incredible about my dad. And I was just amazed, you know. So it's good. I think there should be more, though. I think he should get more credit for more things. You know, it's the kind of thing where, like, I do the crossword puzzle in the New York Times. My dad has never been in the crossword puzzle in the New York Times, and I'm like, what is that about? Because, as I said, he was an American, and he did a lot. And I just feel like, you know, there's a lot of, no, let's not promote Palestinians in this country. So it's interesting. Although now we have Gigi and Bella Hadid, so maybe it'll change.
Thank you.
But that's an example of how he changed. I mean, no, those girls would not have been proud to be Palestinian if they had been born when I was. So that's an example, a direct example of how he changed the world.
Yeah. Thank you, Najla. We have Vitor de Almeida raise his hand. Vitor, can you open the video and ask your question, please?
Oh, no. So, hello, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Is it okay?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was going to be like that. I don't have a camera on me. I'm on my computer, not on my laptop.
So ask your question. That's okay.
No problem.
So I'm an undergraduate on UFSC of history. It's my first semester, and reading your father's work, I just read a bit of it because it was a long semester. It was a lot of stuff, but it was so incredible because I never thought about actually looking as if like West and East and the Oriental is something that was quite made up. It was something that to me, as someone who did not have that knowledge of history, it seemed pretty set in stone. What I would like to ask to you, because it was one of the conclusions that we reached in our course in the end of our semester, was what Orientalism, the work of your father and your work as well, meant for non-Western cultures and trying to get their place in history. So I guess what I would like to ask to you is, do you think that it's something, I'm going to say that I think it's something that was pertinent in studying non-Western cultures, because Brazil finds itself in a curious place because it's not Western, it's not also Eastern, let's say, it's not Oriental. So by reading your father's work, we managed to have sort of an idea of how that non-Western focused or non-Eurocentric history could be made. I would like to hear, do you have any, like, what's your opinion on that, on the role of your father's work on building a non-Eurocentric, a history that is not necessarily around Europe? Because in Brazil, like the history of Brazil, it started with the Portuguese and history.
Colonialism.
Colonialism.
I think that's what I would say. I mean, my father pointed out colonialism and imperialism everywhere, and that's honestly really what the story of Israel is. It's colonialism. It's settler colonialism and imperialism. It's the same history of, coming in and saying, this is our land and we're better than you. We're more civilized. And like I said, you can see it in the Ukraine coverage. I've never, old Ukrainian ladies make a Molotov cocktail, they're heroes. Palestinians make a Molotov cocktail, they're terrorists and they should be burned. So I think that it's been kind of, and I think in America, especially because Americans are starting to use phrases like white supremacy about the systems, the racial systems set up in this country. And they're starting to recognize that this country is founded on colonialism and imperialism, which I don't think, as a kid, we learned about the Pilgrims and the Indians becoming friends and everything was happy and they had Thanksgiving, right? We never learned that the white people came here and killed everybody. And when I was growing up, I didn't know that there were native people in Mexico and that the Spanish came over. I didn't know that. But the history of the New World in general, which would include Brazil, is the same. It's the history of conquest and imperialism. And every country, I mean, I once, this is a silly story, I met this woman who was Brazilian in New York, and she was a Victoria's Secret model. And I looked at her and I said, that's a real double whammy. What do people expect of you? And she's like, it's a nightmare, because in America, a Brazilian woman is immediately the hottest woman ever. And then she's a Victoria's Secret model, so there's an exotification of your culture and of Latin America here too. I mean, it doesn't have to be East to be exotified and all of that. And I think it's interesting because you're from a culture that, obviously colonialism played a huge part in establishing what it is now, but at the same time, you do have all sorts of people who were there originally and people who, came from other places besides Europe. And so, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but it's kind of enormous because it doesn't have to be the East to be exotified and it just has to be other.
Yeah. And
I don't know about Brazil, but I would imagine that being the only Portuguese speaking country around a lot of Spanish speaking countries makes you other in another way.
Yeah, I suppose it does.
Yeah, thank you, Vitor. It's very nice to have an undergraduate student with
Thank
us.
you.
So we have a very mixed audience. And Najla, thank you very much for your time, for your generosity, your mother as well. We hope that you come to Brazil and you'll have your own experiences. We'll organize with Najad. What?
I said I have my suitcase right here. Let's go.
Yalla. So thank you very much. I would like to thank you to the audience. And Najad, please, you can say the final words.
It's Nancy, I promise you, if you are in New York and I'm in New York, I'll call Najla for a pizza, maybe together, all of us.
Thank you so much. This was such a privilege.
So, I mean, there's no words to say how much I'm happy to have my family in New York and my Brazilian friends and my big family in Brazil. And big heart, all the best. I'm overwhelmed, let's say. I cannot speak.
Thank you very much. Najla, final words, please.
No, just thank you. It's amazing to know that there are even people in Brazil who want to listen to me blab. So thank you.
Thank you. We would like to have you here and to listen to more things. So thank you very much. We'll keep in touch. Inshallah, we'll have you here and other events. And thank you very much to all the audience. We'll keep in touch and we'll have other events of Japan as well. So
thank you, Monique.
Ciao. Bye.
Bye, Najad.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was